early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
Let's begin our business of shaping policy for today by looking at the impact of cultural diversity as the world celebrates today as the International Day of Cultural Diversity. We're going to look at the impact and the significance. In 2001, UNESCO scheduled a day like this to have this kind of conversation to draw attention to the significance of cultural diversity across the globe. To shed more light on this, we're being joined by in-house analyst who is very passionate about this subject. We have Sam Orovwuje with us this morning. Glad you have joined us this morning.
Good morning, Femi. My pleasure to be here.
Good morning. Welcome to the show.
Good morning, Blessing. Thank you very much indeed.
I'm quite excited because you are the right man for this kind of conversation. I know you're passionate about this, so it's a good way to start. But let's look at, on a day like this, International Day for Cultural Diversity for Peace and Development, I would like you to give us a background to the impact and the significance of cultural diversity in the world we live in.
Just a little perspective, in 2001, the United Nations Resolution 56249 gave birth to what you call cultural diversity, and the day was set aside to highlight the importance of diversity of culture across the globe. The essence of it is to respect various cultures and draw a commonality among culture for sustainable peace and development. I think the days have been celebrated over the years, but nevertheless, there have been improvement in terms of that particular resolution that we celebrate today as Cultural Diversity Day. The implications are there for businesses. The implications are there for organizations. Implications are there for conflict resolution mechanism, and the implication are there for solidarity across the world. So maybe as we progress, we want to speak to certain elements, particularly the way UNESCO has driven the process over the last 20-something years.
Why is it important to talk about cultural diversity and have a day such as this to even talk about it? We understand that the different cultures in the world, everybody can hold on to their own, but what is the issue?
I think in 2001, based on some research finding, it was found that one of the major challenges to sustainable peace building across the world has to do with culture. And when you look at it from the perspective of what you call cultural relativism, you need to understand that people's culture are very critical for their development. Therefore, we need to respect the diversity of various cultures that make up the globe. Therefore, today is set aside every year to celebrate that diversity, how we can use that diversity to shape peace building and sustainable development. So it's important that we need to respect people's culture, and people's culture is essentially about their values, their food, and their idiosyncrasies. So once you understand the commonality of this diversity, they are able to build peace and sustain global solidarity across the world.
Now, this idea was conceived in 2001 by UNESCO. Now, this is like 23 years after. How will you assess the disposition to respecting cultural diversity across the globe? Let's look like globally, and then we'll look at Africa and by extension Nigeria.
There are still issues with the concept of racism, which has been inimical in terms of global peace. But by and large, when you look at the initiative from UNESCO, that has been able to sustain some educational and scientific exchange, including culture, in terms of how the diversity in culture can sustain peace building. And to that extent, we can see in the last 23 years, there's some semblance of using diversity to drive the process of development. But if you look at it in terms of racial discrimination in the workplace, in businesses, even across countries, then the extent to which this day, the impact to a very large extent, will be minimal. But what today highlights is that cultural diversity is something that we should see as a strength to building peace across the world. In that regard, therefore, I think there's some level of development that has been achieved in terms of driving the process of cultural diversity.
All right, let's look at the impact of cultural diversity on business. What impact does it have?
All right, I think the challenge sometimes is that there's what you call organizational cultural diversity. What that means is that in the workplace, in businesses, you must find a way to give space to every kind of culture that come into the workplace. So you don't need to discriminate based on gender, on your nationality, or what you derogatively describe as tribe in the workplace. So once that diversity is harnessed, then people will put in their best in terms of productivity. So for business sustainability, you need to find a way to draw a common ground across various cultures that make up the business environment or the business place or the workplace. So once you're able to respect diversity, including physically challenged persons, even those who even have sexual perversion in society, but our culture does not support that in this part of the world. But when you look at it from a global perspective, then every kind of culture must be supported, either in business, so that we can draw that kind of sustainable peace that UNESCO is talking about.
Now, talking about the corporate world, it's a known culture, but do you think there should be officially a policy to support cultural diversity, even though in the corporate setting, talk about HR and all that, women personnel, they understand that there's a need to create that balance. But should that be a form of policy to support this kind of practice so that it becomes official and then it becomes better than the way it is?
For global business practices, yes, I think is an HR practice that is enunciated by most big companies. So you need to have a policy framework in place that support cultural diversity. And what that means is that when you are recruiting, even your recruitment processes must take cognizance of various culture, the diversity in terms of gender. There must be equity in terms of gender recruitment process. I talked about those who are into what you call sexual perversion. I don't want to use the word that they are described in. So those who are into some practices that are not okay in terms of the legal framework. Our legal framework in Nigeria does not support that. So I will not sit here to canvass that. But elsewhere, that kind of condition must be put in place, that you take cognizance of everybody in spite of their culture, in spite of their orientation, that you, even those who are physically challenged must have a place in the workplace. And that's what you mean by when you talk about organizational cultural diversity. So it's a practice that the UNESCO supports, even in terms of training, educational opportunities. The diversity must be taken cognizance of so that everybody culture is recognized within the framework of sustainable peace building.
What's your view on cultural stereotyping and how can it affect business relationships?
Cultural stereotyping is a major challenge in sustainable development. So you don't need to stereotype a particular culture against the other culture. And that's why we're talking about cultural diversity as a means of sustaining identity without stereotyping a group of people. And that's why I talked about racism earlier, that tend to stereotype certain culture against other culture. So once you're able to put these practices in place, diversity is always a strength. So you don't stereotype a particular set of people, either in businesses, either in the workplace, or even in the public space. So it's important that we respect the various culture that governize the whole world towards a commonality, like I mentioned earlier.
When it comes to respecting cultural diversity, in Nigeria, there are two popular templates. You have the Federal Character Initiative and you also have the quota system. Talk to us. Do you think these two templates have achieved the purpose intended or has been abused over the years? And what has been the impact of, this Federal Character of 18 and also the quota system?
For me, personally, the quota system was put in place at a particular point in time. There is a constitutional provision. So until we have a constitutional reform, there's nothing anyone can do about it for now. But the point is that it has been abused. What it means originally is that every ethnic group or nationality that make up Nigeria must find a way to be recognized when you talk about recruitment into the federal system. So if you have a dominant nationality that is occupying a place, there's a need to always put other people to reflect a character, a national character that sustain national identity, or what is simply called nationalism for a common purpose. But in terms of practice, that has been abused, particularly when you look at the outcry of those who are in the military high command, certain position at the federal level. People have criticized that that principle has been abused to a very large extent because it has sacrificed merit at the altar of mediocrity, where because XYZ come from a particular place, then you want to have somebody to replace the person to sustain federal character principle, then you put somebody in quote who to a very large extent may not meet that demand if it's based on merit. Then mediocres are elevated, promoted from the level of competence, sometimes to incompetence, as they use it in management studies. So that is the challenge. But in itself, is to sustain cultural diversity, if we highlight it in line with what we're discussing today. But in terms of insustainability and practice, it has been abused. But some people are saying that when that principles was put in place, Nigeria has come a long way, and that the issue of merit should be able to sustain recruitment, particularly at the federal level.
All right. Now, looking at Africa, there seems to be some form of cultural conflict owing to colonization and the after effect of it. How can this be dealt with so that the culture is also preserved while being open to the influence of the Western culture?
I think the challenge here is that while we have a culture in Africa, if you look at the colonizing factor in terms of French, Portuguese, English, that has been to a very large extent inimical to sustenance of our culture, particularly the erosion of indigenous languages that English, French, and Portuguese has depressed over the years. But what we can do, and UNESCO itself is supporting indigenous language development. So what we can do as African is to see how we can downplay the colonial divide of that kind of language that differentiates us as a people. But we must sustain those cultural imperatives that make us unique as Africans. So, and I think various African governments working with UNESCO in the development of indigenous language. I was just reading a report just early this morning from one of my group. A report that was just done by a state university. No, I can be precise, a public institution. Delta State University just did a report on the Orovwuje language, which is part of the language that make up Delta State. And they are saying if care is not taken, in a few years from now, that language is likely to go into extinction. And that's the question that you try to speak to. So in terms of cultural diversity, we must find a way to develop our indigenous culture, Language is equally a part of culture. So once we're able to bring that to bear, then we're able to sustain our cultural imperative. And this westernization of using English as the common denominator, or French or Portuguese, should find a way to improve and find a way that we can sustain our educational development, putting some of this knowledge, particularly indigenous knowledge, into practice in terms of what we do, so that we can develop those contents.
All right, let's talk about intercultural dialogue, as a tool for global peace and development. There's a statistics UNESCO released in that regard, and I would like to read the statement. I would love you to listen, then react to it. 89% of all current conflicts in the world occur in countries with low intercultural dialogue. Now, UNESCO is attributing the kind of conflicts you have globally is taking place more in countries with low intercultural dialogue. Now, if we need to emphasize on intercultural dialogue, what would be the starting point globally? And then let's look at our local environment and talk about intercultural dialogue. How is it going to play out? Or how should it play out?
First, number one, in line with the last question Blessing asked, number one is to find a way to develop indigenous knowledge and language to sustain peace building. Number two, we must have respect for cultural diversity, and that there's no universal culture, that cultures are relative to the indigenous people that make up the world. So once we have respect for different cultural identities across the world, you're able to sustain peace building. That's what UNESCO is speaking about, that we need to respect one another. We need to understand that there are cultural differences, and that we must meet at a point of intersection where culture, in terms of diversity, meets. And once you understand the various cultural differences, and you strike a point of commonality among those cultures, then issues of conflict will be reduced minimally, and you'll be able to sustain peace. And once there's no peace, there's going to be a problem in the world. So culture, in terms of diversity, is critical to conflict resolution mechanism, is critical to sustainable peace building. So once you're able to have an intersection of these three elements, then the world will be a better place for all of us to live in.
Let's look at some factors that makes it impossible to have cultural diversity in a way that every culture is respected. Some practices that may be overlooked or maybe even enshrined in practices or in the norm of a society that work against cultural diversity. Let's begin from schools.
I think the challenge for me generally is that culture is not static. Culture is dynamic. There are certain basic culture that may be static in terms of propelling people's identity, but there are some cultural practices that are not sustainable. Therefore, in terms of the dynamics of it, we can find a way to shape those cultures, but the ones that are really indigenous in terms of practice can be sustainable. But then when you look at it from the point of view of schools, particularly early childhood education, it's important that we must infuse indigenous culture into the curriculum in a way that we can sustain cultural diversity, sustenance of language, even using the indigenous knowledge in terms of scientific discovery. Because in India, in Japan, you see when they talk about engineering, even STEM generally, are taught in the indigenous language, and over time, in terms of development, they are far apart from Africa. Therefore, as a people, a day like this is important that schools must find a way to put indigenous language, culture, beyond the element of social studies in the junior secondary school. I think culture should get to a level where we can even do that beyond the junior secondary school, up to the senior secondary school, and find a way of imputing culture, even for those of us who are in the media environment, see how we can sustain our culture imperative to sustain peace in the long run.
What about socially? Are there ways that certain cultures are ascribed supremacy over others that should be looked at on a day like this?
I think that's sad and is unfortunate where you talk about stereotyping earlier. Once you think your culture is better than the other person's culture, then you are looking for conflict. And these are some of the instigators of conflict across the globe. So cultural diversity just simply means you must respect various culture. Therefore, nobody should ascribe his culture to be a superior culture against the other person. So we must have a meeting point, a kind of intercession, where you respect my culture, I respect your culture. Therefore, we can build a global peace.
Now, you observe that in spite of the advocacy to respect cultural diversity, we still have tribal sentiments, you still have cultural bias, and in fact, you have some superstitious beliefs that also work against cultural diversity. Even in Eastern, I remember there's a particular part in the East where there's a particular tribe. They do not marry each other. And you wonder if that exists within a region, what could happen globally? So, in spite of the level of advancement, technology, education, you observe that in the larger society, you still have this prejudice about cultural diversity. How do we erase this kind of sentiment or superstitious beliefs? Some even attach, to some of this culture, they attach spirituality to it. How do we erase this kind of mindset?
First of all, we must look at the sociology of identity, which talks about class and caste system. These are cultural nuances that were sustained over a period of time where certain people ascribe a kind of class identity to themselves, and some other people are lower in society. You call them, this is practiced even in some culture in Nigeria, even in India. As we speak, in spite of the level of development, you still have this class and caste system. I think when I talked about the dynamics of culture, where I say culture is dynamic, some of those class and caste system must be done away with. And this is why a day like this is set aside to highlight and see to what extent can we use the various identity to strike a common balance among the various nation or nationality that make up the world. On the other hand, colonialism, to a very large extent, was equally used to sustain tribalism. And tribalism, in my own understanding from sociology, has to do with a kind of derogatory word that used to describe people. So once we're able to change this not friendly language in terms of the way you frame your narrative when you use certain words. Like, I'm very careful, I don't like to use the word tribe. Rather, I don't even use the word ethnic group. I prefer to use nationality because we're a commonality of nations that make up a nation state. So if we avoid these derogatory words that are the dividing or fault lines in terms of the current global ecosystem that sustain a superior class and an inferior class. So the identity is that you don't really need a culture to validate another culture. So culture should validate themselves. And at the point of intersection, and I use this word advisedly, there's intersection of culture. So what are the various elements that are good in this culture, So we intermarry them and see how we can live in a sustainable manner, not putting a class or a caste into some group of people that make up society. We're all wonderfully made by God. It's just geography, language, and culture that is a dividing thing. So we can marry those differences in a common way that can sustain global solidarity and collaboration.
All right. Let's look at migration. As regards cultural diversity, culture shock that some persons experience when they get to a different environment with different culture, particularly when language is a major barrier. How do you advise that people navigate this challenge?
No, it's a major challenge, even if you travel ordinarily, even if you are not really migrating to really stay in a particular environment. Once you shift environment, particularly geography, where you're used to waking up at X number of time, you move into another geography. So those culture are natural, but I think the barrier, like you put it, has to do with language differences. But then if you are migrating to a culture that is different from you in terms of language, what you need to do is to wean yourself of your cultural idiosyncrasies that you were used to, and wear a new culture of the environment that you have gone into, so that you can re-engineer your mind, the process, so that you can sustain yourself based on language, based on food, and based on other cultural differences that you are not used to, so that you can infuse yourself into the culture of the new environment. Because if you don't do that, there's likely to be a challenge in terms of how you can sustain your livelihood in that particular environment.
All right, let's look at the business side of this, where you talk about culture that belongs to the creative sector. And according to statistics released by UNESCO, that sector has created about 48 million jobs globally, especially for young people. Now, how do we take advantage of the potential, the business opportunities inherent in cultural diversity?
If we look at Nigeria in particular, to answer your question, is to find a way to do cultural mapping, look at the various culture within the country, and find a way to develop a business blueprint in line with the National Development, Tourism Development Agency, to see how we can use culture to drive tourism, which is essentially about the business of culture. See how we can look at the Kogisis of this world, the Bogu Lakes of this world, the Tinapas of this world, and perhaps the Oshu-Oshogbo festivals of this world. Find a way how we can map them, look at the business model in terms of tourism and development, and see how we can upscale the process of using culture to drive development. The business of culture is a very strong business, and the government, on the other hand, must find a system that can protect that area, because when you talk about culture too, you talk about intellectual property. Culture too has some element in terms of those who are able to preserve the culture. So once there's a bit of a regulatory framework, a policy framework that helps to sustain that cultural diversity, and how we can see the way to drive foreign direct investment using culture as a means of national productivity and development. The other day on this one of your programs, we're speaking to how the Nigerian government wants to improve access to visa regime so that people can come into the country. So that regime as well, it must take cognizance of the cultural diversity we have as a people. How can we harness this diversity as a business, particularly in the issue of tourism and cultural development?
All right, in a time where cultures mix, there's also the challenge of preserving cultures, as some cultures are going extinct. Now, what can be done, particularly for the African culture, to preserve the culture and also sell it rightly? You talked about tourism, but we know that culture also has a lot to do with art, which Africa is rich in.
Yeah, I think for Africa, we need to find a way to sustain, first and foremost, the indigenous practices of various communities or nation or nationalities that make up the 54 states of Africa. Number two, the various languages must be taught in schools, and I spoke to that earlier, from the junior secondary school even up to the senior secondary school. Two, we need to preserve culture, particularly those that are very indigenous. We talked about medicine, we talk about artifacts, we talk about arts in itself. then linguistic sustenance in terms of the etymology of the language itself, so that we can preserve those language as part of our identity. Once you lose some of those elements and make up your identity, then you don't even have an identity first in the first instance. So, number one, preservation of cultural sites, preservation of indigenous food, preservation of indigenous languages, preservation of indigenous medicine in a way that they can move from one generation to the other generation. So the concept of intergenerational studies must equally come to culture and development so that we don't lose any aspect of our culture. Preservation is very critical. And countries like Japan, India, and some of the Asian countries have sustained their culture over a period of time. So I don't see why Africa should be in a hurry to lose their cultural identity.
All right. Africa should not be in a hurry to lose their cultural identity. What a soundbite for us to wrap up this conversation. Like I said, you're the right man for this kind of conversation because I know you're passionate about this. And so we must thank you for your time and your thoughts on the issue of cultural diversity on a day like this.
Maybe we'll make him the ambassador of culture on Early Exchange.
That would be a good one.
Thank you very much indeed. Blessing and Femi. My pleasure, always.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.